Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone to our special event tonight, UNIV101 Race and Reparations. This is the third of our 4 signature UNIV101 events organized in conjunction with the new Duke University undergraduate course, The Invention and Consequences of Race. My name is Nayang Amy Kwan. I'm a professor in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and one of the co-conveners of the course. This is a faculty-led curricular initiative supported by the Office of the Provost, the Duke Endowment, and the Office of Undergraduate Education. We would also like to thank our co-sponsors of this event, Duke Human Rights Center at Franklin Humanities Institute and the Stanford School of Public Policy. This university curricular initiative and event series is part of a broader effort to highlight the ongoing realities and legacies of racism through innovations in the Duke undergraduate curriculum. We want to welcome especially the students of the course in our inaugural class. We anticipate more relevant courses to be developed and featured in an ongoing conversation on reckoning with race and racism in our past history and in current society. It is my honor to introduce our featured speakers tonight. They will lead us in a timely conversation about the possibilities and perils of reckoning and repair in the wake of violent historical atrocities such as slavery, segregation, and the persistent legacies of systemic racism in American society today. Professor William A. Darity Jr. is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. He is the co-author of the award-winning book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. He is joined tonight by his co-author and partner in crime, Kirsten Mullen, who is a folklorist and the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the concept development team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Tonight's conversation will be centered on their book, in which they advance a general definition of reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure. Our moderators are Dr. Adrienne Lentz-Smith and Dr. Duncan Williams. Dr. Lentz-Smith is Associate Professor and Associate Chair of Duke History, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives, Modern America, and History in Fact and Fiction. Dr. Duncan Williams is the chair of the University of Southern California's School of Religion and professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, and the director of the USC Shinzo Ito Center for Japanese Religion and Culture. In this conversation, we hope to center the question of reparations for Black Americans and also put this case study into conversation with other historical cases, such as the successful redress movement for survivors of Japanese American internment in the wake of World War II. At the end of our event, we will have time for questions from the audience. So if you have questions at any time during the event, please drop them in the Q&A box below your screen, and we will address them at the end. So without further ado, I invite our speakers to the spotlight.
Well, I assume Adrienne is starting this.
Well, I can. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the conversation. Hi, fellow panelists. Welcome to the conversation. What we thought we would do to begin is to have Kirsten and Sandy say a few words of intro, and then have Duncan jump in. Or would you like me to start with a question?
We can say a few words of intro, especially since Amy mentioned that we open our book by defining reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice, I think it might be helpful if we elaborate a bit on that. And then Kirsten might have a companion comment about the scope of the injustices that we think are relevant to the case for Black reparations. But our definition of reparations is a general definition, which would be applicable in all instances in which compensation or restitution is due to a victimized community. So the first component of our definition is what we refer to as acknowledgement, which is essentially the equivalent of an apology. But it is an apology for the grievous injustice, an apology conducted by the culpable party. But it's an apology that must be accompanied by a commitment to engage in an act of restitution. That is to say, the culpable party acknowledges that they have committed a harm and agrees to provide some form of restitution for the harm that has taken place. And I would add, frequently people talk about a process of stopping a harm as if it is an act of reparations, but it is not. It's great to stop the harm, but it does not constitute compensation for the effects of the harm. And that's the second component, which is redress. And redress is the act of restitution on the part of the culpable party. And this typically has involved monetary payments to the victimized community. I think that Duncan is probably going to talk a bit more about the Japanese American reparations experience in the aftermath of their unjust incarceration during World War II. But that's an instance in which the United States government made an apology and also made a monetary commitment to the individuals who had been subjected to mass incarceration. We could argue about whether or not the compensation was adequate, but a monetary payment was made. In the case of the victims of the Holocaust, the German government made payments in the aftermath of World War II. And the US government has made payments to communities that have suffered harm that were not necessarily, the harms that were not necessarily caused by the US government's own actions, where, instances where the US government wasn't the culpable party necessarily. So a couple of examples are the provision of reparations payments to families that lost loved ones during the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and payments that are being made to the individuals who were held hostage in Iran during the waning years of the Carter administration. And I believe the typical individual was held for about 440 days, and the federal government has made a commitment to pay $10,000 per day of captivity. And so this would amount to $4.4 million per person. Okay, so that's the second component, it's redress. The third component is closure. And what do we mean by closure? Well, we mean that, and the account is settled, that the two parties, the culpable party and the victimized community, come to an agreement that the debt has been paid. And as a consequence, the victimized community will make no further claims on the culpable party for any additional restitution unless there is a renewal of the atrocities or a new wave of atrocities take place. So this is essentially what some people refer to as a non-repetition commission. I'm sorry, a non-repetition commitment. And that's essential for making the act of closure something that is cemented. So the account is settled, and that leads us to closure. And Kirsten, I think you're going to talk a bit about what the scope is of the case for reparations, specifically for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
Yes, I'm actually going to read an excerpt from our book, From Here to Equality. So we like to say that our work draws a thick line from the nation's origins to the present. The case we build is based on all three tiers, all three phases of injustice. So slavery, first of all, American apartheid, what we blithely refer to as Jim Crow, which was, a nearly 100-year period that was marked by over 100 incidences of white riots. And these were efforts of white supremacists to suppress Black people in their efforts to gain full citizenship. These were incredibly destructive in every possible way. People's homes, their businesses, their livelihoods were destroyed, but individuals were injured and killed over the course of this 100-year period. And then the combined effects of present-day discrimination and the ongoing deprecation of Black lives. Most advocates of Black reparations have focused exclusively on the injustice of slavery as a basis for redress. And we blanch, say now when we hear this term, slavery reparations. It's like, there's no such thing. We're talking about, all of American history. So law professor Boris Bittker argued that the case for Black reparations should center solely on the harms of legalized segregation. Roy L. Brooks, another legal scholar, has argued that the foundation for Black reparations is the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. So we submit that the bill of particulars for Black reparations also must include contemporary ongoing injustices. So we're talking about injustices resulting in barriers and penalties for the Black descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. So sociologist Joe Fagan catalogs the continuing injuries inflicted on Black Americans, and he lists wage penalties, physical and psycho-emotional health wounds, and community and institutional damages. Despite the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, a wave of federal legislation in the 1960s and 1970s intended to eliminate legal apartheid in the United States and the enactment of anti-discrimination laws. But despite all of this, Blacks continue to bear the weight of American racism. So that burden is manifest in labor market discrimination, in grossly attenuated wealth, confinement to neighborhoods with lower levels of amenities and safety, disproportionate exposure to inferior schooling, significantly greater danger in encounters with the police and the criminal justice system writ large, and a general social disdain for the value of Black lives. The legal apparatus created by the Civil Rights Revolution does little to address the complex web of harms imposed upon Black Americans today. Taken individually, any one of these tiers of injustice, slavery, the regime of legal segregation and subordination, and current discrimination makes a powerful case for Black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore. We'll stop there.
So you all mentioned that you make a case for reparations for Black Americans specifically, but you also say that there are other instances, other examples that you can look to that we might talk about. Duncan, would you mind walking us through reparations for Japanese Americans and give us a sense of where that came from and what the federal government did?
Sure, of course. I was just thinking, just because maybe the Japanese American World War II incarceration is not quite as well known as the history of slavery, enslavement, and Jim Crow and so forth. I thought maybe I could share a few slides to give some images of that period, and then talk a little bit about the campaign for Japanese American reparations. And so I'm going to share my screen and show a few images along the way. I'm sorry. So the first thing I wanted to just show a map of where in the United States, really a large number of different confinement sites that held 125,000 plus people of Japanese ancestry, targeted just because of their racial background. The United States was, during World War II, also at war with Italy and Germany, but it was only the Japanese that experienced this mass incarceration. And there were 10 big camps, but as you can see, there were many other camps that also held Japanese people of Japanese ancestry. About 2/3 of the 125,000 people were US citizens, not afforded, usually before you go behind barbed wire and so forth, you're afforded a jury of your peers or some kind of due process, but they unfortunately did not receive that kind of consideration. And among the very first people, not among the very first person who was picked up right after Pearl Harbor was a Buddhist priest, the head Buddhist priest of a temple in Honolulu. And he went to this camp where the internees themselves built the little tents where they would be imprisoned, and actually built the fence with barbed wire that they would live behind. And people like Reverend Miyamoto Buntetsu from Hawaii, this is his FBI, his warrant of arrest, and then he's placed in this category as people were in the first group of people arrested, individuals who were deemed a threat to national security. And so both Sandy and Kirsten mentioned this kind of long line of thinking in the United States about race that from the founding on. What happened with the Japanese American during World War II didn't come out of any nowhere. And in the case of Asian immigrants to the United States, this idea that they represent some kind of threat to national security, national identity, they called it a yellow peril, a group of people who were sometimes with the Chinese, they were called the heathen Chinese. It was kind of like a slur word of the time, but a racially unassimilable group and a religiously unacceptable group that was going to, threaten, as you can see in this Harper Weekly thing, this idea of the Buddha in these clouds threatening, and this World War II image of a Buddha on a tank with a samurai. Like there's this conflation that these are people that are going to invade, overwhelm, and disrupt the idea of a white Christian nation. And so that is one kind of image I wanted to say. There was talk at that time of building a Chinese wall around the United States, on the Pacific symbolically, and this idea of this despotism that would happen if too many Chinese came to the United States. And so Asian American, incarceration is very much linked to Asian American exclusion around the border, exclusion around the ability to become citizens, naturalized, and so on and so forth. And one of the few people who spoke up back in the period of the Chinese exclusion for the idea of a composite nation, or a nation that was made from many faiths, many peoples from different parts of the world, was Frederick Douglass in his famous composite nation speech in Boston. And I mentioned this because he gave, I think, a really interesting analysis of how Asian American history and Black history is connected. And one of the things that he mentions in his speech, I didn't quote here, was the idea that on the one hand, he understood as a Black American the idea of exclusion and not being able to see these people as equal, human beings. But on the other hand, he also mentioned that America was, its wealth and why immigrants wanted to come in the first place was built on the backs of Black Americans. And so he made that linkage between thinking about Black history in connection to what's happening around Asian immigration and exclusion. And I'm going to bring this up one more time a little bit later, but I'm going to show two more slides and I'll stop. You see in this photo in the truck, little kids. It's little kids, infirm grandmothers, mixed race babies in orphanages. The director of the incarceration program, after an executive order called 9066 was issued by President Roosevelt, said, if they have a single drop of Japanese blood in them, I want them in camp. He was referring to mixed race Japanese American children who were given up for adoption in orphanages. So that's how what I would call the ethnic cleansing of the West Coast happened. Everybody with even a single drop of Japanese blood, 125,000 put in camp, and they ended up in places initially like this, horse stalls, county fairs. This is Pre-Alpha Assembly Center, 30 miles south of Seattle for people who lived in Washington State. So I'm going to stop sharing and just make one other quick comment about the reparations program itself, which was how should you say, instituted or kind of advocated for by three main Japanese American groups, the Japanese American Citizens League, or the JACL, that often took care of the legislative strategy. There was another group interested in a lawsuit called the National Coalition for Japanese American Redress, NCJAR, and they pursued a kind of more legal approach. And one of the people that inspired me even today was Reverend Kyoshiro Tokunaga. He was one of the only people on the lawsuit for Japanese American redress. He was helped during World War II when he was arrested right after Pearl Harbor and taken to one of these internment camps. He was ill, and a African American train porter helped him. And they discussed, not only helped him in his health, physical health, but as they talked about their respective experiences of their communities, he began to realize what was happening to him had already happened to Black Americans for multiple generations. And he became a big advocate after the war for racial reparations, initially for Japanese Americans, but also during the period he was alive for civil rights for Black Americans. And that kind of interlinkage was represented by people like him on NCJAR. And then finally, the third group called NCRR, the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. They were very strong grassroots movement. The kind of bigger point I want to make is that they didn't always agree. That's why they had three groups. They didn't always agree about what would constitute racial reparations for Japanese Americans. But in the end, as I think all know, 1988, there's a Civil Liberties Act of 1988. There was a bill that was passed that included the items that Sandy and Kirsten referred to, both the apology, a formal letter apology, from the United States government to each person, but also a $20,000 check, a direct cash payment to individuals, as well as the setting up of an education fund that would be more collectively approached. And so that's the result. It didn't come easy. These three groups often very much disagreed about what would constitute reparations, who would be eligible. That act in '88 said, ultimately, the way they crafted it was not only people who were incarcerated, but people who were otherwise affected by Executive Order 9066. Meaning, for example, there was this short window right after the executive order and when people were rounded up for camp. And some people managed to move east of the Western Defense Command line. And those people were also eligible for reparations. And I think that's a really important point, that for Black reparations too, it shouldn't just be about, we can have a broader view of what might constitute reparations and the broader category of people that were affected not only by slavery, but by Jim Crow and its after effects over multiple generations. But those are the type of debates that took place. And it did lead to, I think, the first large-scale federal racial reparations bill that passed. And today, Japanese Americans are also at the forefront of trying to be a good friend to, back in the Japanese American case, people like Representative Ron Dellums from Oakland, California, who saw his 6-year-old friend, Roland, being taken away, Japanese American friend being taken away by the government. He advocated strongly for Japanese American reparations. And today, I think our Japanese American legislators and community members are very much trying to be at all, if in any way, at all helpful for the HR 40 and other efforts to have reparations for Black Americans. And so let me just stop there. And there's many things I want to talk to Sandy Kirsten about, but let me just stop there.
And so I want to put a pin, and I want to come back to a bunch of things that y'all have brought up, and kind of where you ended this conversation, Duncan, with a sort of question of how, right? So the question of how we get to a common sense understanding that reparations are a reasonable thing to think about, as well as how one then achieves them. And questions of who, and then, I want to come back to questions about HR 40 specifically as one proposal, and whether or not that's what y'all think of that. But before we do any of that, I actually want to ask a super abstract question. And I will tell you this question comes from having picked up From Here to Equality when I was in the middle of binge watching the TV show The Good Place. And so misapplying the question that organizes, it's a sitcom that's really a sitcom about moral philosophy. So misapplying the question in that sort of is the title of Tim Scanlon's philosophy book, What We Owe Each Other, right? So how do we and should we think about reparations as a question of what we owe each other and who owes what to whom? And I guess within that is a question about whether or not a conversation about reparations is a conversation about philosophy or history or economics or policy.
Or all of the above.
Right.
Yeah.
The answer is always all of the above, right? That's the academic's answer.
Let me start to try to begin an answer to that by indicating what we think the characteristics of an appropriate reparations plan for Black Americans ought to be. And we think that there are 4 pillars. The first is we have to establish criteria for eligibility for reparations. So not only the question of who should pay, but who should receive. And in the work that Kirsten and I have done, we've emphasized 2 standards for eligibility. The first is an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And we refer to that as a lineage standard. The second condition is an individual would have to show that for at least 12 years before the enactment of a reparations program for African Americans or the establishment of a commission to study reparations for African Americans, an individual would have had to have self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. And we refer to this as the identity standard. So that's the first pillar, establishing eligibility. The second pillar concerns the determination of how much the reparations bill should be. And we argue that the singular criterion for identifying the amount of the reparations bill should be the magnitude of the existing racial wealth gap in the United States. Wealth, which is the difference between what you own and what you owe, or the gap between your assets and your liabilities, or another way to put it, the net value of your personal property. This is a far more significant indicator of economic well-being than your income, in large measure because if you experience an income shortfall, if you have adequate wealth, you're not going to be subjected to any significant change in the quality of your life. Of course, wealth also enables you to buy your way into high amenity neighborhoods. It enables parents to ensure that their sons and daughters get an education that is debt-free. It also enables parents to more effectively navigate a difficult criminal justice system by purchasing sound legal advice. It also enables folks to better participate in the political process in a country where electoral politics is heavily monetized. And then, of course, it allows parents to deliver resources to the next generation to provide them with greater opportunity and greater security. So we argue that the historical basis for the gap in wealth between Blacks and whites is a consequence of the cumulative intergenerational effects of white racism. And so that should be the foundation point for establishing the minimum amount of a reparations bill. We look at the Federal Reserve's most recent survey of wealth in America, the Survey of Consumer Finances, and we find that the average difference in wealth between Black and white households is about $840,000. This means in turn that this is approximately a gap in wealth of about $350,000 per Black individual. And if we were to allocate that amount to the 40 million Black Americans who are descendants of US slavery, and this is 40 million out of a total of about 45 million Blacks in the United States, the bill would be somewhere in the vicinity of $14 trillion. Okay. So the third dimension of this reparations plan would be the determination of the way in which the funds should be distributed. And we argue that the primary way in which the funds should be allocated is through direct payments to the eligible recipients. Now, these direct payments could be cash transfers, or they could be less liquid assets like a trust account or an annuity. But the key factor from our perspective is these funds must be delivered in such a way that the individual recipients have full discretion over its usage. And then finally, we actually come to the answer to the question that you posed, where the fourth pillar of the reparations plan must identify who should pay. And from our perspective, it is the federal government. And it's the federal government for two fundamental reasons. The first reason is because the federal government is the culpable party. If we think about the array of atrocities that have been visited upon Black Americans, they have been visited upon Black Americans in the context of a legal framework that was established by the federal government, or as a consequence of the federal government essentially ignoring the atrocities at all, not punishing them, not compensating the victims in the past. So that's the first reason. The federal government is the responsible party. And the second reason is because the federal government is the capable party. If we were to take the combined budgets of all the state and local governments in the United States, it would amount to approximately $3.1 trillion. Now, we just said that the total bill is at least $14 trillion. And so it's absolutely impossible for state and local governments to meet the bill, apart from the fact that the federal government has culpability. What?
Echoes a lot of it. I think the other piece I was thinking about was, how the racial wealth gap was created and how it's maintained. Sandy mentioned that the racial wealth gap is this really effective way of measuring. It's this indicator of white supremacy in the United States. And he also talked about how the federal government has played a role. It's had an active role in the creation of the situation that Black Americans find themselves in. Either the federal government, when white mobs were attacking Black people, the federal government, could have stepped in and said, this is illegal. We're not going to allow this to happen. Sending in troops, making certain that trials were held and that people were held accountable. But this is for the most part, not what happened. But we look at the end of the Civil War, when the federal government made a promise to the newly emancipated Black people and said, we're going to give you 40-acre land grants and settle your families on this land. And if you work the land, develop the land, it will be available for you to purchase at reasonable rates, right? And a small percentage of Black families were in fact settled on 40-acre land grants even before the war had ended. But Abraham Lincoln, under whose watch this plan was developed, was assassinated. Andrew Johnson becomes president, and he reverses this program completely. And then he also demands that the land be given back to the Confederates, given back to the traders to the United States, and leaving the Black freed people in the cold, right? So they have no property, they have no prospects, they have only the options for many of them was to go back and work for the very people who had enslaved them formerly. But they're doing so under incredibly difficult conditions. They don't have the legal authority to negotiate on their own behalf. They cannot leave, they can't break these contracts. They have to accept whatever pay is offered. And if there are any disputes or any difficulties, they don't have any standing in the courts. So this is what happens to the freedmen. At the same time, beginning in 1862, the federal government issues the Homestead Acts, and this legislation provides 160-acre land grants in the Western territories that were, for the most part, given to white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe. So this is land that had just recently, been occupied by Native Americans. So this was an opportunity for the United States to complete its colonial settler project. So we're talking about 287 million acres of land that were given to 1.5 million white households. The last land grant was patented in the 1980s in Alaska. This is an incredible program. It's the single, government policy. And that 1.5 million white households translates to 45 million living white Americans who are still reaping the benefits of that Homestead Act today. There's some incredible stories that we have heard about some of the families that received these patents. We had the opportunity to meet on 2 occasions with high school students in a class in Carborough, and this is Matt Cohn's class, and he asked the students, to interrogate their own family's wealth positions and find out, talk to your grandparents, talk to your great-grandparents, and find out what you can about where the wealth in your family came from. And the students were, very skeptical about what they would discover. But in fact, significant numbers of the white students found GI Bills in their family history. And almost all of them were for the purchase of a home or a business or a farm. That's a small number of the Black students. I want to say something like 2 of the Black students in the class had GI Bill.
No, I don't think any did in that particular class.
Of the 2 classes, though, combined.
Oh, there might have been.
So one class had about 73 students, one had about 50 some.
Yeah.
But 25% of the white students found a Homestead Act patent. And in fact, one student held the patent. They had found the patent, and it was dated to 1842.
Right.
Andrew Jackson had signed that patent. I mean, it was incredible. And then when they discovered where the land was, one student said something about going to visit a relative who had a farm, I want to say in Chatham County, and discovered that, it's worth several $million today. Another student had a family member who had land in what's now Arlington, Virginia, and it was worth millions of dollars today. So, this is a situation where it's like the federal government is giving these white families a monthly dividend check. There's another instance, one other quick one. It's a family, not that Matt Cohn told us about, but that Jennifer Mueller was talking with her students at Texas A&M University. And one student learned that their grandparents had been given land in the Texas Panhandle, which they decided they would lease. Okay, so they're receiving an income stream from this land. And then the patriarch dies. His widow decides to move to Austin, Texas with their 8 children to give them a better shot at going to college, to university. 6 of the 8 graduate with a college degree, debt-free. Then the mother dies, and the 8 decide to continue to lease the land. So they continue to receive the benefits of profits from this government free equity, and split the profits 8 ways. Then in 1980, a full 100 years after they had been given the land, natural gas is discovered on the land, and the revenues are so amazing. It's the largest such deposit in that area, and the profits were over $100,000 during that first year alone. So this is these are examples of ways that the federal government actively invested in building wealth for white families, but at the same time disinvested in Black wealth.
I have questions going in 2 different directions. One, I want to quickly come back and ask you, Duncan, so this is in some ways a very useful and material discussion about reparations and why and how wealth was built. I'm curious, Duncan, about how you became interested in the question of reparation and whether for you it is also a material question, or if there's something else kind of underlaying your interest in it. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you my follow-up question for you, Kirsten and Sandy, because otherwise I'll forget it, but which is a question of when one asks students to do this kind of investigative work, do they foreground guilt as their response? And what do you do when people want to talk about how they feel bad instead of what one can do, if that question makes sense? So I guess you first, Duncan. And I'll remind you, so I'm doing my questions, but we're going to go in about 15 minutes to broader Q&A, and audience members, you should feel free to just load up the Q&A section kind of right there on your Zoom with your questions.
Thank you. Well, first, before I directly answer that question, I want to just say, I can really recommend From Here to Equality as a book. There's just so much more about chronicling the evidence of the harm, and then also these very clear-minded analytical proposals for how to do the repair work. And it's a kind of very balanced book in kind of like both narrative, but also kind of like keying on, and I feel like the way you all just answered that question kind of demonstrates what's in the book. But I think I want to tag my answer to you about how I got interested with your original question about who owes, what to whom. And it comes out of the fact that I've been in the United States now for 34 years. I came when I was 17 years old from Japan as an immigrant. And my dad is British and my mom is Japanese. And one of the questions that a lot of us who are like immigrants or, recent, immigrated to the United States, including whenever I talk with my colleague in my department, he's a leader in the African-American Muslim community, Sherman Jackson, and he has the office right next door. And he often tells me when he brings up the question of Black reparations in the Muslim community, as I do in the Buddhist community, because I'm also ordained as a Buddhist priest and serve a historically Japanese American temple. He says, sometimes, the non-Black Muslim segments of the American Muslim community wonder like why we just got here from war, whatever, and why should we have to pay more taxes or do like we're not responsible for what white people, that kind of thing comes up a lot. And in certain Asian immigrant communities, that kind of talk often emerges too. And so I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be an immigrant in this country. I actually became a citizen only last year on Juneteenth of all things, and it actually seems symbolic to me. It's like racial justice has been delayed, and it has taken multiple generations to get anywhere, and yet the promise of America as a new immigrant is still there. And I think for me, it's something about who do we, as a nation, we owe it to ourselves to correct this and fix this. And yes, it happened in some form for Japanese Americans, but we have to do this just as a new citizen, like the honor of the nation or something. Like we need to do this. And so that's how I like to talk to my friends in the Buddhist community, for example, about the idea that Reverend Tokunaga, who I mentioned earlier, the one that got helped when he was on that train, he talked about back in the 1970s, he would talk about, there's karma, like this, you have actions and you have, if you do negative, there's some consequence. But he's like, there's a karma of a nation, that America has a racial karma that we inherit even as recent immigrants. And whether we have actual, connection to enslaved persons or slave owners or whatever, it doesn't matter. We inherit it all. And that we therefore, and so yes, to, the Darty Mullen suggestion about the federal government, our nations represent, that's where it needs to, happen. Of course, local effort, this is all wonderful too. And there are some specific things about certain universities, and why not talk about it at different registers and so forth. But ultimately, it is a national issue. And to me, it's kind of like a matter of national honor. As a recent immigrant citizen, I feel like we should all support Black reparations because whether we like it or not, inherit both the negative things, but also the positive things, and we just have to, as America, as a nation of becoming, as in a way that idea of composite nation that Frederick Douglass talked about. This is what our job is in our generation.
I was going to say one quick thing before you jump in. We like to say that when you migrate to a country, you migrate to its history and to its obligations. And it's important, for individuals to do that research and to understand what it means to migrate to a country. As we've said, it's fairly clear that a lot of people who immigrate to the United States, not just Black people, but whites and Asians and others, they are attracted to what they see on the ground, which was made possible by the forced labor of Black people in this country for hundreds of years. But yes, we absolutely,
No, absolutely, spot on. We actually have a passage in the book that I think echoes this very set of ideas. We say all those who subsequently migrated to the United States have moved to a country whose contemporary promise of opportunity is anchored in its history of exploitation of Black lives. The slave trade and slavery extended their tendrils into every fissure of the American economy, producing a hothouse effect that created vast national wealth. America's economic success was built by the unrelenting enslavement of Black people. One can hypothesize a counterfactual chain of events where American economic growth took place without slavery, but this is the actual way in which it all began. And an addendum to this is another point that Duncan mentioned that's expressed by some of his compatriots, which is the idea that, it's not just a question of us not being here while these atrocities took place. It's also a question of the way in which the Black-white wealth disparity actually got created. Now, Kirsten put a very specific focus on the nature of federal policies that promoted white wealth accumulation to the disadvantage of Black wealth accumulation. But there are many Americans, and we talk about this in some detail in chapter 2, there are many Americans who think that the racial wealth gap is attributable to dysfunctional behavior on the part of Black Americans. Black Americans make bad financial decisions, or Black Americans don't save enough, or Black Americans have too many single parent families, and that's why the wealth level is so low. And in chapter 2 of our book, we try to take down each one of these arguments in a very systematic fashion. So, for example, it's noteworthy that white families with a single parent have 2 times the wealth of Black families that have 2 parents. It's noteworthy that there's no significant difference in savings rates between Black and white households once you take into account household income. And indeed, for some income categories, the Black savings rate is slightly higher. The source of the Black-white wealth gap is the inability of Black parents and grandparents to transfer significant resources to subsequent generations because they were denied the opportunity to accumulate those resources. And as Kirsten pointed out, with respect to the massacres, in instances where Black communities had achieved a certain level of prosperity, their property was either destroyed or it was seized and appropriated by the white terrorists. And as we noted, there were 100 of these massacres that took place from 1863 in New York City in the midst of the Civil War up until Detroit in 1943 or so.
And 100 actually seems like a conservative estimate to me.
It,
But
it may be,
Yeah,
it may be.
I suspect that those are the ones that are most documented or most known, or that people are willing to talk about. But you know, if 1919 alone had 35
Yeah.
kind of riots around them. But what I was going to say is, one, the historian in me really loves your response, because your answer is rooted in walking people through the history. I think you also flag something that, and Duncan, you do too, right? If my question was about how you work with or around people's guilt, part of your response is also saying it's not just about people wanting to talk about them as individuals feeling guilty. It's a lot of people saying, I'm not, like, I have nothing to be feel guilty about. I don't feel like I participate in this. And your response is, history explains the creation of structure, and you live and operate within the structures that exist. And your investment in keeping them in place is actually continuing the harm.
Yeah, but I would add that we do try to soften the bullet in a sense, because we don't advance a program where money is taken out of white people's pockets and put into black people's pockets. We advance a program where the federal government bears responsibility for financing the project. And our expectation is that the federal government would do this in much the same way in which it financed stimulus packages during the Great Recession, or the ways in which it has financed the American Rescue Plan or the CARES Act during the pandemic. And that is to say, the federal government essentially just cut checks and did not increase taxes. And there's absolutely no reason why that can't be the same strategy that is deployed for the purposes of financing a reparations plan. Now, Kirsten, you may want to comment about the danger that's associated with inflation and what we have to make sure we do about that.
But so there are at least two strategies that one could take, and one of those would be to lengthen the period of time over which the reparations payments were made, and we would would hope that they would be no more than 10 years. But Sandy also mentioned earlier other types of assets that are less liquid. If you're trying to create a mechanism for individuals to be able to draw on their wealth for some period of time, you could construct a portfolio of assets that would include, we think it's important for symbolic and substantive reasons for the assets to include a check, but it also could include, annuities or trusts, so the individuals are drawing down the, part of the interest, but not touching the principal for some period of time. That's important. I hope we can get to the I don't know if you wanted to just say more, ask more of Duncan, but did you want us to focus on the question that you had for us about the students?
The student sense of guilt.
So this is an interesting one. So a couple things have happened. So we've met with this class twice, and I do remember after the first. It was amazing experience. Matt Cohn had the students, as they were reading the book, each of them was responsible for creating a video for us that sort of encapsulated their impressions of the book. And they were from 1 minute to 6 minutes apiece, like 73 of these videos. It was incredible. And then, once we got a chance to meet with them, you're sort of seeing what some of their misunderstandings were. A lot of the students didn't really understand the difference between wealth and income, for example. Some of the students thought that Black people had received 40-acre land grants. None of them had ever heard of the Homestead Act. And these were honors classes. And I do remember that the instructors had to create a secondary conversation after we left the Zoom, because the students were fuming. They were saying, we're supposed to be the best and the brightest. Why haven't we been taught this? I mean, they were just livid. This is not a good education. We're supposed to be in this, it's a public high school, but it's a very, very wealthy community. And they just were really angry that not just, as high school students, but all the way through, there's so much information that has been shielded from us. So that was interesting. So there was a mixture with the students. I mean, some of them, it was interesting to see the students who felt able to tell you that their family owned plantations. And you know, we were curious and asked them where and how many enslaved people, and they were pretty forthcoming. And you could tell that their classmates were kind of shocked, you know, to hear some of this. But you know, and then some of them really did question how their parents or grandparents kind of downplayed the role of these governmental programs, or downplayed the role of, you know, having owned Black people, even though they owned in some cases, you know, dozens or even hundreds of Black people. It was fascinating, but you got the sense that they were wanting to know more. And it's also interesting too, a number of the students were from families that were fairly recent immigrants to the United States, and they also had GI Bill benefits. And some of them actually also had Homestead Act benefits.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but you know, they frequently had a grandparent
Right.
who had migrated to the United States,
Mhm.
who had been able to take the benefits of the GI Bill, particularly for home ownership purposes. Yeah.
I mean, a couple of them did express some anger toward parents who had given them this rhetoric that, you know, I worked hard, or I had a great plan, I was an innovator. And then they also discovered, well, actually there were these other programs, and all that may be true, you know, probably was true, but they'd had some tremendous boosts before that. Springboard, exactly.
So we've come to the time to open it up to broader Q&A. So I'm going to flag this, even though we don't have a chance to respond to it right now. It's interesting that the students are angry and wish that they knew more at a moment when I kept thinking, there are places where your book can no longer be on the curriculum, or this is a book that would really heat up the Virginia governor's race, right? If they can't read Beloved, Lord knows they can't read this, right? And that I don't think it's an accident that the misinvocation of critical race theory, but what is a rejection of understanding how history produces unequal structures, right? That is that pushback has become so loud precisely at a moment when people are willing to have a substantive conversation about how one addresses.
And I don't know what Duncan's thinking is about this, but wouldn't this kind of attack on instruction and curriculum also lead to the erasure of conversations about mass incarceration of the Japanese American population, or the yellow peril for that matter? Yeah.
I think that's a excellent segue into the audience Q&A. So we have been queuing them up since the beginning of the conversation. There are quite a lot. Let's just get right to it. So there are a couple of questions about comparative perspectives. We talked about some of the solidarity formations and you know, across different communities and so forth. But I think there are also concerns about maybe a zero-sum game. You know, there are other issues like the genocide and removal of Native Americans, or what's going on with offering immigrant families separated at the border. And then, of course, we were talking about the solidarity movements between African Americans and other immigrant communities. So could you talk about the possibilities and tensions between, you know, thinking about these questions of reparations within the U.S. in a way that we can move forward instead of sort of competing with one another?
I can't see you.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know where we want to start with this one.
I'll talk a little bit about solidarity. I hope Duncan will too. But
Yeah, I'm not sure why these are competing matters. But go ahead.
well,
I mean, I don't see why this is necessarily a zero-sum game.
right.
Yeah.
I can remember the moment when we were on a podcast, and the host, who was from Eritrea, asked us about alliances that were being formed around the issue of true reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And the nations of the African continent. And for a moment, we were struck dumb because we thought, well, that would be a great, thing to have happen. And then I remembered, and Sandy joined in, how when I was a college student, and there was a tremendous, this is back in the Pleistocene era when I was in college, but there was a tremendous amount of energy around students, especially Black students, but not just Black students, focusing on South Africa and strategies for ending apartheid, putting pressure on financial institutions, putting pressure on Congress. And this was absolutely a moment when, Americans were pushing in support, pushing in solidarity with the nations of Africa. And this is also the period too, when so many African nations were seeking independence from the colonizers. So I thought, okay, so we can flip that, right? And, what would it be like if, African nations said, well, we will no longer allow American corporations to invest here, to set up companies here until Black Americans Black American descendants of U.S. slavery receive reparations. What would that be like? If there was that kind of integrity, that kind of intentionality. I can certainly foresee that. What we have seen a bit more of is the kind of tension between the tension that arises around the question of eligibility. And you have members, Black Americans whose families immigrated, from the 1960s and coming forward, saying, well, we should be included as well. And we would say, well, these are groups that have very different histories. The immigrant groups are not descended from people who were enslaved in the United States, were not deprived the promise of 40-acre land grants,
which establishes the
central debt that the federal government owes. Now, it is absolutely the case that they quite likely have reparations claims to make against the countries that colonized their ancestors. So if you are from Haiti, then that claim would be taken to France. If you were from Jamaica or Trinidad or Antigua, that claim would be taken to the UK, for example. We believe there's solidarity in these groups talking about strategy, learning more about their own histories, devising different ways to quantify the debt. But what we've observed, and I think Duncan touched on it a little bit earlier, is that the specificity of the claim is really important. And what we have seen is this kind of log rolling, well, we'd be happy to talk about Black reparations if we could also talk about reparations for all these other groups simultaneously. And I guess we would say, why when the possibilities for Black American reparations are on the table, do we need to, do people start saying, well, we need to bring in all these other groups? It is certainly not the case that, Holocaust victims were lumped in with other groups. Nobody said, well, what about the Native Americans? Well, there's no connection there.
No.
This doesn't make any sense.
Nor should there.
Nor should there have been. Now, there is an organization called CARICOM, which is fighting for reparations for residents of the Caribbean. Now, they don't include Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, nor should they. But the converse is also true. Black Americans or U.S. Descendants of U.S. slavery should not be compelled to include all of these other groups. And we see, individuals who are saying, yes, you must, bring all these groups together, as another way of just derailing the entire conversation.
I think that it's important that we recognize that there's a difference in these claims, that they're not all the same claims and they shouldn't be collapsed together. I think it would have been an obscenity to suggest that other communities' sense of atrocity should have been incorporated into the Japanese American claim for restitution. If we think about the other community in the United States that probably has a very long-standing claim for for reparations, which would be the Native American population. People sometimes talk about slavery as the original sin. Well, no, the original sin was the appropriation and colonization of the land that was held by indigenous peoples. So they definitely have an appropriate claim, we think. But their claim is one that is focused on the question of sovereignty, whereas the claim that Black American descendants of US slavery have long been focused upon is obtaining the material conditions for full citizenship. These are not the same claims. And there are other communities that might well have claims, but I think the question that might be embedded in this concern about whether it's a zero-sum game is a question about whose claims you prioritize. And from our perspective, we kind of have a sense, well, finally they're talking about our claim. I mean, our claim is 156 years overdue. So, it's kind of peculiar when we hear people say, well, group X, Y, and Z needs to be considered simultaneously when the Black American claim has been pushed to the back of the bus for 156 years.
I think the challenge is always going to be that even when, for the Japanese American case, although all these Japanese, I mentioned the three groups, they really work hard on, trying to mobilize initially actually just within the community. And that commission model there was a commission and there were some commission hearings in places where Japanese Americans were concentrated. And it was really hard to even get these elderly people who, were not just young kids at the time of the incarceration to come up and speak about the harm that they experienced. And so part of the effort was this kind of internal community kind of organizing, but the question of solidarity, there was a African-American city councilman at the LA Japanese American hearing that gave a passionate speech at that hearing. There was a Latinx farm worker organizer who also similarly gave, and I think the point of trying to make, so I guess what I'm trying to say is there is something very powerful about placing different communities' histories seeing them in an interlinked larger whole, where that actually produces solidarity as opposed to the worry that I think Sandy Kirsten was talking about, where having all of those things talked about at once actually either derails or decenters the important conversation that right now, especially, I think, what was it, HR 40, had enough co-sponsor, and had the vote that out of committee for the first time. So there is a momentum, and so I think there's a kind of strategic aspect to how to talk about things, but also the need for, people of different backgrounds to really come and support Black reparations. And that in some sense does require doing some of that interlinking people so that people feel like, oh yes, my community structurally has in the same structure that produced the enslavement and its legacies, if we're all interlinked and connected. I think that actually potentially can also have some positive effects of garnering the support of a big movement of people all across America who should be, for Black reparations.
I just wanted to quickly add that I love that Sandy's initial response to this was, I don't know why we would see this as a zero sum, right? Because what he's doing is blowing up the sense that approaching it as zero sum is commonsensical, when actually the sense that it would be zero sum is produced by the ideology that sort of undergirds white supremacy, that's designed to make sure that solidarity is harder than assuming that people have to compete for something, right? As if the spoils are a thing you earn instead of the sort of goodness of the commons that should be available to many.
Yeah, it's driven by an embrace of the scarcity principle.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that keeps all of this in motion, this notion of fear, that if I have something, then you have less. Yeah, that we can't both be whole somehow. This was making me think too about how public opinion has evolved. 20 years ago, colleagues at the University of Chicago had a survey, asking Americans what they thought of cash reparations for Black Americans, and only 4% of white Americans thought this was a good idea, right? 4. And then 16, 18 years later, another survey was taken, and that number had jumped to about 16%, so almost 1%, in the right direction per year. And then this year, the number had jumped to over 30% of white Americans. So, still not a majority, but absolutely much higher than 4%, and moving in the right direction. Just the fact that this conversation has been sustained in this way, it gives me a tremendous amount of hope. Reparations used to be a word that politicians especially did not invoke. I mean, it was like abolitionists. You didn't admit that you had friends who were abolitionists. You didn't, let yourself be seen at their meetings. You hid your correspondence until the tide changed, and you had the Civil War, and the body count was so high, and suddenly the abolitionists were sages. Everyone wanted to hear what they had to say. I was very encouraged by the comment that Tim Tyson made about how it's important for us not to get frozen and feel that don't be frozen by fear, don't be frozen by guilt, but to use this opportunity as one to inspire action. I want to say something about HR 40, which is this is a legislation that is now some 30 years, was introduced 30 years ago. But it's the bill that provides for a study group, a study commission to look at possible proposals, right? And for reparations. And the problem is, it's the only game that we have. It's the only game in town. And people feel like they have to say they're either for it or against it. But very few people talk about the content of the bill. And for us, there are 4 major structural problems with HR 40. First of all, it doesn't identify who the eligible recipients of reparations should be. And as Sandy has said, we have these 2 criteria that these are eligible recipients are people who can meet both an identity standard and a lineage standard. So these are people who can trace their ancestors to at least one person who was enslaved in the United States, and individuals who 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations study commission or the enactment of a reparations program self-identified on a legal document as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro. Second, HR 40 does not specify that one of the major targets of reparations is the elimination of the racial wealth gap, which is huge. I mean, that absolutely needs to be part of that legislation. Third, it doesn't indicate that reparations should be paid directly to the eligible recipients. So this opens the door for, the committee to deliberate and at the end say the United States government needs to issue another apology, and business is closed. We've achieved our aims. Or they could say, we're going to accept a series of programs that cities have enacted and call that reparations. As Sandy has already said, it's not possible for cities or even states to achieve reparations. They don't have the budget. They don't have the funds to do this. If all of the budgets of all of the cities, all the municipalities in the country and states combined is $3.1 trillion. And we're talking about debt that is $13-14 trillion on the low end. And then fourthly, HR 40 does not specify who the culpable party is. HR 40 does not say the federal government will pay.
It says everybody's the culpable
Everybody's
party.
the culpable party. So it just feels like this nebulous piece of legislation that's not going to get us anywhere near true reparations. And then there are also some structural problems with the bill. The bill currently has 15 commissioners. Originally there were 7. Then it ballooned. It's been revised several times, and it ballooned up to 13, then to 15. It indicates that the commissioners will be paid $172,000 a year, which we think is really inappropriate. Commissions of this type, generally are not compensated financially. Their expenses are paid, and certainly the staffs that support the work that they're doing are paid, usually full time. But the idea is that they are reviewing these materials. It's not a full-time job. They all have day jobs, and we just feel this is a sacred mission, and these individuals should not be paid, and certainly not the kinds of salaries that they are proposing. So the director of the commission has the opportunity to select 6 members out of the 15. A quorum is only 7. So you can imagine, so not a majority, not a supermajority, but 7 is a quorum. So you can imagine the director and the 6 people that he or she identifies could hold a meeting, make decisions, and the rest of the commission members would be, and America itself would be in the dark. Very importantly, there's a legislation called the Federal Advisory Committee Act. This is legislation from the 1970s that was created to prevent commissions like this from operating in the dark. This is legislation that requires legislative committees to have public meetings, to engage the public, to make their minutes, their agendas, their reports available to the public. The revisionists on this bill have asked to be exempt from that legislation. Why is that? They also have specified that no elected officials may serve. No mayors, no city council members, no governors, no members of Congress. What is that about? Now, interestingly, it is illegal for those individuals to be paid for serving on commissions. So it seems that the people who revised HR 40 want to make sure that the people who serve do get paid. So Black American descendants of U.S. slavery may not get reparations, but the individuals who serve on this commission absolutely will. So it's a strange bill. And when you talk to people, they're like, I had no idea that was in the bill. I can't even tell you how many elected officials we have talked to who said, one was a really disturbing moment when we were in a Zoom with a legislator who said, Kirsten, how do you know that? And I said, it's in the bill. It's in the bill. It was extraordinary.
One additional point, which is the version of the bill that we are critiquing is the bill that came out of the Judiciary Committee hearing in April. And it is actually not quite the same version as the one that you will find online.
Yes.
That predates the Judiciary Committee hearing.
You can only find the January iteration online currently.
Very interesting.
We have questions.
There are a couple of questions about strategy. Professor Williams talked about how in the Japanese American reparations case, the 3 main actors really, had to compromise. And so we're also talking about the HR 40 with all the, pitfalls and so forth. But it is, over 30 years old. And so if you could talk about some strategies we can take, because there is an urgency to this, right? And we've always been kicking the can down the road, and what you call the procrastination, right? Towards justice. So do you see sort of a timeline and kind of political strategies that communities can take, even though this is a federal, in the federal jurisdiction? Are there certain local and state and maybe African-American communities, can come together to move this forward? What are some strategies that people can take?
Yeah.
Certainly individuals, it's individually and collectively can write Congress. You can lobby Congress and tell them that you support a full, true reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. The city of Durham city council members unanimously passed a resolution to this effect. The resolution also indicates that they see these flaws in HR 40 and what needs to be changed in that piece of legislation. But we can do this, not just as individuals. You could do it in any formal and informal groups to which you belong. Your book club, your ultimate frisbee group, your artisanal beer collective. All these groups can come together and discuss these issues and write to Congress. Several folks have suggested that they're going to get their communities to engage in a massive letter writing campaign. I was struck to learn, I was a guest at the Episcopalians United Against Racism forum earlier this week. And I asked them if they would allow me to use part of the time as a focus group for me. Because I was interested to learn what kinds of things they were hearing in their community from Black people, and this was a very mixed audience, but from Black people who oppose reparations and whites who oppose reparations. And so initially it was just this dead silence, and then one of the moderators, who was Black, came on and said, "Well, I'll start." And so and she was Black, and so she talked about several things. And then after the 2 or 3 Black people spoke, one Black woman said, "I'm really hurting now because I don't hear any of my white sisters and brothers speaking up. We've been together in this forum for several years and I need to hear from you." And when several of the white members of the group, the forum, spoke up, they said something along the lines of, "We don't talk about this. Among my white friends and family members, this does not come up." And so either there is a presumption that we all are on the same page, even though we haven't discussed where we are, or there's a tremendous fear that there might be some points of disagreement and people are afraid to even to look into it. And one of the things that they requested of me was, can you give us some talking points? We want to have our list so that when we do engage in these conversations, that we can, we can respond fully and be able to have citations so that it's not just coming from us, which I thought was just very interesting. The kind of ammunition that they felt that they needed to engage in the conversation, which, I think that, I honor what they're saying, and I look forward to engaging with them.
There's a group of mayors who have moved towards endorsement of reparations, but I think there's a couple of detours that they have tracked on. One of the detours is treating, as we said, treating support for HR 40 as if it is necessarily support for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And so they have not placed much of an emphasis on the need to either replace or revise HR 40. But the second is, in many instances, they are saying that they're going to set up their own local reparations plans. And we are extremely skeptical about this notion of local or piecemeal reparations. We think that that actually is a potential distraction away from the harder task of trying to pursue a comprehensive federal program of reparations. And as we pointed out, if your target is to eliminate the racial wealth gap, localities and states, either singly or collectively, simply cannot do it.
So obviously we're at Duke University, even though this is open to the wider community. And I really appreciate a lot of people from outside of the university setting who've showed up. And Kirsten and Sandy, you have really done the footwork in terms of going to our students, high schools, and you're such spokespeople for our university too. Could you tell us a little bit about, what is the role of education here? Because again, Duncan mentioned how, we actually know a little bit more about slavery and Jim Crow than the Japanese American internment, but we actually don't, like, to the degree, right? And so the anger that your honor students in the high schools feel, our Duke students feel the same in our classes all the time. They come into our classes, it's the first time they've ever heard of Juneteenth and so on and so forth. So could you just talk a little bit about how this, especially the first, part of the acknowledgement and just, the education component, could you tell us a little bit about some strategies we can take in these communities?
One of the things that we learned while researching from Here to Equality is that there is a reason why we are all misinformed about our history. Jacqueline Dowd Hall, our colleague who was at UNC Chapel Hill, has written at length about the work of groups like the American Daughters of the Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who got in the textbook writing business. They identified authors who were in agreement with their lost cause narrative, and who were willing to talk about the glories of the plantations and how slavery was just the best thing that ever happened to Black people, and how gallant and noble these secessionists and traders were, and how supportive and it's very interesting the way the women are portrayed. They're both delicate but steely, but these women, these are well-heeled women, went to education conferences, and they identified the historians who were writing textbooks that were accurate, and they had these people blackballed in many instances. And then they turned around and lobbied for the state archives. Our state archival system is a consequence of their work, and their first collections were provided by these groups. They interviewed Confederate veterans. They got them to donate items of their clothing, locks of their hair, photographs, and then they started the state marker system. And they're incredibly prolific. They still are. We often say, if these women had been the soldiers, the foot soldiers for the war, they probably would have won. So determined have they been. So, one of the things that we talk about from Here to Equality is the importance of having history books that are accurate, that tell the whole story. People say, oh, we need to talk about Black history. We're talking about America's history. This is our history. And, as important as I think it is for us to, like you said, Amy, we don't know, we can't let go yet of these different, nationality history moments or months, because that history isn't known. But we really need to be talking more and more about our shared history. And it's not that the information isn't there. It simply wasn't presented. I mean, I've been struck so many times by, looking at historic newspapers, and I'll see the article that was quoted in the textbook, and right next to it will be an article about Black people. It's like, it's right next to it, but it was just not deemed important enough to be included. So we think for at least 3 generations to have new curriculum written, all the way, from kindergarten through college. And the hope is that in 3 generations, we would not, revert to having to have this conversation again, that, the world would have a clear understanding of what our history is. I mean, you think about, American soldiers raising the Confederate flag at US bases around the world, basically teaching the world that the Confederates won the war. Teaching the world that these are the people that we honor. These are the people who have meaning for us. This is really a problem. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I think, there are a lot of people who are willing to do so. I think that the cover story for the Raleigh News and Observer today has to do with Confederate monuments and what to do with them. So people are thinking about this stuff. But a lot of it has just kind of gone past us. We just kind of, it's so ubiquitous that it hasn't really registered that, or people, it never occurred to people to wonder who the Bragg of Fort Bragg was, et cetera, who was Julian Carr. But yes, we need to be much more.
But it's also, It's also important to note that those textbook wars are ongoing, right?
Yeah.
And for
Yeah.
every
Yes.
attempt to
Absolutely.
deepen and enrich the story, there's a sort of loud and well-financed and intense desire to keep people from knowing.
Yeah, you keep telling lies.
We keep telling them.
Actually. Well, we're out of time, actually a little over time, and I really appreciate everyone who has stayed after, because this has been such an engaging conversation and there will be more. So thank you so much for all of you. You are doing amazing work and this really gives me hope. I've dropped a podcast series that feature Kirsten and Sandy. And so please, Professor Darity and I get to call him Sandy, but go ahead and listen to those podcasts that comes out of our very own Sanford School. I've also dropped a link to the UNIV101 information, including our final signature event that's coming up on Thursday, November 18th, about Hollywood and representations, cultural, racial representations, and so forth. So hope to see you all there. And Adrian and Duncan, we will co-teach something in the future. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
Great.
Good night.
Thank you all
Good night,
very much.
everybody.
Good night.
Take care. Indeed is that.